She was just a waitress, finishing her shift in the rain, until she noticed an elderly man struggling to cross the street. No one else stopped. She did. 2 hours later, the mayor showed up at her diner, asking for her by name. What followed unraveled decades of silence, a hidden system that had protected the town, and a man the world had forgotten. But why did he choose her? And what did he leave behind? This is the story of one simple act and the legacy it uncovered. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The rain had started around 10:45. Quiet at first, a mist you could ignore if you were moving fast enough. But by noon it had turned into a steady drizzle, the kind that soaked through denim and clung to the skin like second thoughts. The streets of Brookhaven emptied, the usual lunchtime foot traffic replaced by parked cars with fog windows and bus benches occupied only by puddles. Grace Miller stood at the corner of Ash and 3rd, one hand clutching her canvas tote bag, the other wrapped around the collar of her worn denim jacket. Her apron, still tied around her waist, was damp along the hem, stained with the day's coffee refills and grease from the flat top. She had clocked out 5 minutes ago, but the rhythm of work still pulsed through her, shoulders tense, brain ticking, feet sore. The diner sat behind her, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the gray sky. She could still hear the familiar clatter inside, dishes being stacked, the kitchen radio playing faint oldies, Marcy yelling something about pickles. But Grace had stopped thinking about all at the moment she noticed him. He stood across the street, just beyond the awning of the closed hardware store. An elderly man, hunched against the rain, his gray coat patched with dark, wet blotches. A black cane trembled slightly in his left hand. In the other, he held a thin plastic grocery bag stretched almost to tearing, its contents, 2 soup cans and a loaf of bread, knocking together as he shuffled forward. His shoes were soaked, the laces uneven, and he moved with the caution of someone who didn't quite trust the world to hold him upright. The light at the crosswalk changed. Cars rolled through the intersection with the lazy entitlement of small-town traffic. He took a half step forward. No one slowed. No one rolled down a window. No one looked. Grace glanced to her left. A man in a delivery van sipped coffee from a thermos. To her right, a woman on her phone turned away from the street, umbrella angled perfectly to ignore everything outside her conversation. Grace stepped off the curb. Her sneakers hit a shallow puddle, sending water up the back of her legs, but she didn't flinch. She moved quickly, but not so fast as to startle him, her voice gentle as she approached. "Sir, can I help you across?" The man looked up, startled at first, eyes pale, clouded blue beneath heavy lids. He hesitated. "I'm fine," he mumbled, but the words wavered. "It's slick," she said, not insisting, just offering. "I've got good balance. Occupational hazard." That made him smile, just faintly. She reached for his arm, lightly, like she'd learned from helping her grandfather years ago. Let him lead, but stay steady. He nodded and allowed it. Together, they stepped into the street. The bag swayed from his hand, the cans clinking as his steps shortened. Grace matched him pace for pace, scanning the pavement for anything that might catch his foot. Cars waited, but none honked. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet. When they reached the far curb, she paused. He took one more step, steadied himself, and let out a breath. "Thank you," he said, his voice clearer now. "They don't usually stop." "I notice," Grace replied. She offered a half smile, the kind that came from tiredness and too many shifts, but also from some stubborn corner of her that hadn't been worn down yet. He nodded again, and without another word, turned and made his way down the narrow alley beside the hardware store. She watched him go until he disappeared behind the dumpster, swallowed by a shadow. Back at the crosswalk, the light had changed again. She crossed back alone, her jacket heavier now, soaked through. Her phone buzzed. Marcy asking if she'd left her umbrella behind. She hadn't brought one. Grace stepped into the diner's side entrance and let the warmth hit her face. She didn't say anything to anyone. No one asked where she'd gone. A coffee mug clinked against the plate. A fork hit the floor. The world kept going. But outside, in the rain, something small had shifted, just slightly, like a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples no one had noticed yet. His hand was cold where it met hers, the finger stiff but surprisingly steady once she took his arm. They moved slowly, careful not to rush. The crosswalk timer had already counted down, but the cars waited without protest, engines idling in quiet deference to something they couldn't name. Grace didn't look at the drivers. Her focus stayed on his feet, each cautious step, the shuffle of soles over slick pavement, the way his cane tapped rhythmically as they crossed. He held the grocery bag tightly, though it trembled with every shift in weight. "You always work around here?" he asked, his voice rasped by age but still clear. "Diner behind us." "Second shift today," she said. "You from around here?" "Since 1959. He chuckled under his breath, a dry sound more memory than humor. "Though I reckon I've been invisible since 95. They reached the other side, the curb just a few inches higher than it should have been. He paused before lifting his foot, and Grace gently tightened her grip on his coat sleeve. He stepped up with a quiet grunt, steadied himself, and gave a satisfied nod as if they'd just finished something important. "Much obliged," he said, glancing sideways at her. "Glad to help." She expected him to keep moving, maybe mutter goodbye and vanish into the afternoon fog, but he lingered for a moment longer, looking toward the alley beside the post office. "What's your name, miss?" "Grace. Grace Miller." He nodded slowly, eyes scanning her face like he wanted to commit it to memory. "Walter Finch, 83 and change. Nice to meet you, Mr. Finch." "Just Walter." He shifted the bag in his hand, the plastic crinkling softly. "People don't usually stop, you know. Not unless there's a camera or someone watching. You'd be surprised how often a man can almost fall and still be invisible." Grace glanced at the alley, half shielded by the overhang from the old post office roof. It led to the rear parking lot, mostly empty now that the building had been converted into storage units. "You live back there?" "Upstairs from what used to be the tailor shop," he said. They turned it into apartments sometime in the 80s. Not much to look at now. Grace wanted to ask more, but something in his posture said not to. He seemed content to let their conversation rest where it was. "I used to walk the same route every Friday," he said, lifting his cane as if to point it toward the sidewalk. "Down to Whitman's for a sandwich, then over to the library. These days I settle for soup and a crossword in the window." He looked away as he said it, like he was remembering a time he didn't talk about much anymore. But today felt different. Don't know why. Grace didn't press. People like Walter often carried full chapters of their lives unspoken. Instead, she gave a simple, quiet answer. "I'm glad I was here." "So am I." The rain picked up again, tapping against the metal awning above them. He adjusted the collar of his coat and turned toward the alley. "Don't let him change you, Grace Miller," he said without turning back. "People forget too easy. This town, most towns, they move so fast they don't even see what's holding them up." With that, he disappeared around the corner, the soft tap of his cane fading into the alley's narrow passage. Grace watched until he was gone, the street feeling quieter now, even though the traffic hadn't changed. She stood there another moment, unsure why she felt like she just missed something bigger than the moment suggested. Then she turned and made her way back toward the diner, unaware that 2 hours from now, the mayor would come looking for her, not because she had done something extraordinary, but because she had noticed someone everyone else had stopped seeing. The bell above the back door rattled when she pushed it open, its old metal tongue knocking against the frame, like it was more annoyed than welcoming. Inside, the air hit her like a slap, warm and thick with the smell of frying onions, burnt toast, and dish soap. The hum of the overhead lights buzzed over the crackle of the fryer and the hiss of a spatula scraping against the griddle. Grace stepped onto the black and white checkered tile, her sneakers leaving faint wet prints behind her. "Where have you been?" barked Carl, wiping his hands on a rag that had once been white but now looked like it had given up. He didn't wait for her to answer. "Table 6 needs water, 9's ready to cash out, and that guy at the counter wants his burger redone. Says it's pink in the middle." Again. Grace nodded without a word, shrugging off her damp jacket and hanging it on the rusted hook by the back freezer. She tied her apron back into a loose knot, smoothing the front with the palm of her hand. The fabric was still damp from earlier. Her fingers smelled faintly of rain and the man's coat. The place was packed the way it usually got just afternoon. The windows fogged from the inside. The booths filled with farmers, store clerks, and retirees reading newspapers they barely glanced at. It was a kind of lunch crowd that expected familiarity served with their food. Names remembered, refills poured without asking, complaints handled with a smile no matter how undeserved. "Coffee's cold," muttered Mr. Denton, waving his mug in the air like he was conducting an orchestra only he could hear. Grace stepped to the counter, took the pot off the warmer, and topped him off. He sniffed it, frowned, and took a sip anyway. "Much better," he said, though she hadn't said a word. He looked right through her like always. She could have walked in with a new haircut, a broken arm, or soaking wet shoes and still gotten the same squinting nod he gave anyone in an apron. Grace turned to table 6, where a mother with 2 toddlers was wiping jelly off one kid's cheek, while the other one pressed his face to the window. She refilled their water, asked if they needed anything else, and wrote "extra ketchup" on her notepad without being asked. It was the same every Thursday. The cook shouted from the pass-through window, "Order up club sandwich, no tomato." Grace grabbed the plate and delivered it to table 4, where an older couple sat in near silence, passing the salt back and forth with a kind of quiet rhythm that only comes from years of eating meals together without needing conversation. The man glanced up, nodded once. The woman didn't look at her at all. "Grace, can you grab another roll of quarters from the office?" Carl called over his shoulder. "Change drawers low again." She moved without responding, weaving through tables like she was still on some invisible track. The sound of forks scraping plates, laughter from a corner booth, a glass breaking somewhere in the back. None of it felt real. Not yet. Her mind kept drifting back to the alley, to Walter Finch's hands, to the way he said her name like it mattered. But in here it didn't. Not really. By the time she returned from the office, the rhythm of a shift had swallowed her whole again. She poured drinks, cleared plates, printed receipts. She smiled when she needed to, apologized when it was expected, nodded when she didn't know what else to do. No one asked where she'd gone. No one noticed she'd been gone at all. Outside, the rain eased a fine mist, the kind that clung to windows like fingerprints. Inside, the diner pulsed on, loud and fluorescent and unaware. Grace refilled the sugar canister at the end of the counter, her eyes drifting toward the window. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure at the edge of the alley, just beyond the reach of the overhang. But when she looked again, it was gone. The wall clock above the coffee station ticked with the kind of slow determination only old clocks had, the kind that had been keeping time longer than anyone remembered to look at it. Its glass face was cracked in the corner, and the second hand jerked unevenly every time it reached the number 12, like it hesitated before deciding to keep going. Beneath it, the smell of scorched decaf hung in the air, a scent so familiar no one noticed it anymore. Grace wiped down the counter for the 3rd time in an hour, not because it needed it, but because it gave her hands something to do. The lunch rush had come and gone. A half-empty napkin dispenser sat next to the condiments, and a lone slice of lemon floated in the bottom of the ice water pitcher. The sound of cutlery had faded to the occasional clink, and the booths were quiet now, filled mostly with people pretending to read the local paper or scrolling to their phones while they waited for the clock to give them permission to leave. Grace moved from table to table, clearing dishes with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd done it too many times to think about. She asked if anyone needed anything else, not expecting them to say yes. They didn't. They never did. At 2:37 p.m., just as the second hand stuttered its way past the top of the hour again, the hum of conversation was broken by the deep, idling purr of a car engine, not the usual rusted pickup or faded sedan. This one was different. A long, black town car pulled up to the curb out front, sleek and spotless despite the rain. The diner's windows reflected its polished surface, the same way they sometimes caught the glow of lightning in summer storms. Unexpected, sharp, and a little too quiet. Inside, nobody looked up. Not at first. Mr. Denton kept reading the classifieds. A college kid in the corner booth chewed the straw in his iced tea. Marcy at the register tapped her pen against the counter, trying to remember if she'd reordered pie crusts. Grace, though, noticed immediately. The man who stepped out of the car was tall, clean-cut, maybe early 40s. His suit was tailored, charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe that didn't catch the eye so much as direct it. His shoes were polished to the kind of shine you only saw at funerals or fundraisers. He didn't carry an umbrella. He didn't flinch when the rain landed on his shoulders. He just stood there, scanning the street like he was looking for something or someone. Grace paused mid-step, a tray of empty glasses balanced in her hand. She watched as a man turned his head slowly from left to right, examining the storefronts, the old pharmacy, the quiet post office. His eyes passed over the newspaper stand, the faded "For Rent" sign in the window next door, and then stopped, settled, on the diner. Not just on the building, but on the glass, on her. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a phone, and said something into it before slipping it away. Then he crossed the sidewalk and pushed open the front door. The bell chimed, not like it did for regulars or delivery guys. This time, it sounded louder, clearer. Every head turned. Grace set the tray down behind the counter, wiped her hands on her apron, and tried to still the sudden tightness in her chest. The man scanned the room once more, then walked straight toward her. "Miss Grace Miller?" he asked, voice even, precise. She blinked. "Yes." He didn't offer a business card, just a measured nod. Mayor Eleanor Briggs would like a moment of your time. The diner fell completely silent. Even the ticking clock above the coffee station seemed to pause. The silence in the diner wasn't immediate. It spread, slow and deliberate, like a ripple in still water. First, the rustling of a newspaper stopped. Then the sound of a fork tapping against a ceramic plate faded, followed by the low buzz of someone's ringtone being abruptly silenced. Conversation stalled in mid-sentence. Even the sizzling from the kitchen seemed to draw back into itself. Every eye turned toward the door as it swung open again, letting in a brief gust of humid air and the unmistakable click of heels on tile. Mayor Eleanor Briggs didn't rush. She didn't have to. She walked into the room the way someone enters their own office. Straight-backed, composed, and with the kind of presence that settled in before she even spoke. She wore a slate blue raincoat, perfectly tailored. The collar still dried despite the weather. Her gray hair was tied back neatly at the nape, and a delicate gold pin gleamed against her lapel, one that marked her years of public service and wasn't often seen outside council chambers. Behind her followed a younger man in a dark suit, holding a leather portfolio against his chest and scanning the room with the quick efficiency of someone who always needed to be 10 steps ahead. The aide's glasses slid slightly down his nose as he looked around, then back toward his phone. Grace stood frozen behind the counter, unsure if she should move or stay exactly where she was. Her apron was damp, her hands still faintly sticky from refilling syrup bottles, and she suddenly felt every wrinkle in her shirt. She tried not to stare, but when Eleanor's eyes landed on hers, there was nowhere else to look. "Grace Miller?" the mayor asked, her voice calm but carrying enough weight to command the room. Grace nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." The mayor took a step closer, folding her gloved hands in front of her. "Would you mind stepping outside with me for a moment?" The question came without explanation, but it didn't sound like a demand, more like a request wrapped in something more serious. Curiosity, maybe, or obligation. Either way, Grace could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. Carl, the diner's owner, stepped out from the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel. His brows drew together beneath his balding forehead, his mouth already parting to speak. But the mayor simply raised a hand in a polite motion that stopped him mid-step. "This won't take long," she said without turning. Grace glanced around. Every table had gone still. Mr. Denton, for once, had lowered his newspaper entirely. The couple in the corner stopped mid-bite. Marcy, frozen at the register, blinked as though trying to make sense of what was happening. Grace untied her apron slowly, letting it fall into a loose bundle in her hands. She stepped out from behind the counter, her sneakers squeaking slightly against the floor as she crossed toward the door. She tried to smooth her hair down without looking obvious about it, but there was nothing to fix. She felt like a child being pulled out of class without knowing why. The mayor held the door open for her. Rain still hovered in the air, light but steady, enough to miss the sidewalk and darken the brick walls of the buildings across the street. Grace followed her out under the awning, heart pounding in her chest with a kind of quiet, slow panic she didn't fully understand. The aide joined them, flipping to the portfolio, though he said nothing. Eleanor turned to Grace and regarded her for a long moment, like she was seeing her not for the first time, but in a new light. She studied her face the way a person looks at something important they almost missed. "Do you remember helping an elderly man cross the street earlier this afternoon?" Eleanor asked softly. Grace's throat tightened. "Yes, his name was Walter." The mayor nodded, a strange look crossing her face, something between relief and gravity. "Good," she said. "That's exactly why I'm here." They sat at the corner booth, the one closest to the window where the blinds were always half bent and the faux leather seats peeled at the seams. Grace slid in on one side, unsure whether to fold her hands or rest them on the table. She could still feel the stickiness of syrup on her fingertips. The scent of bacon grease clung to her sleeves, mixed with the industrial citrus of diner soap that never quite washed anything clean. Across from her, Mayor Eleanor Briggs sat perfectly composed, coat folded over the back of her chair, not a single drop of rain visible on her blouse or her posture. The aide stood nearby, flipping through papers in the portfolio without looking at them, eyes occasionally darting to the window or the front counter. His presence felt like pressure, quiet, efficient pressure. Grace shifted slightly in her seat, aware of the eyes behind her. The entire diner had resumed its normal rhythm. No one said anything, but plates were pushed aside, drinks held halfway to lips. People watched openly, like they'd been granted permission to. Marcy stood frozen near the coffee machine. Carl leaned on the edge of the kitchen's pass-through, arms crossed, face unreadable. Even the couple in the corner, who never paid attention to anyone, had turned slightly to see what was happening. Grace cleared her throat. "I don't mean to be rude, but I'm not really sure what this is about." The mayor gave a small smile, measured but not unkind. "You're not in any trouble, Grace. Quite the opposite, actually." That didn't ease the knot in Grace's chest. She nodded, unsure what to say. The mayor reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not official, not legal. It was old, slightly creased, and looked like it had been handled more than once. She placed it on the table, slid it toward Grace, then waited. Grace picked it up. It was a handwritten note, ink faded, the handwriting elegant and slanted. The paper smelled faintly of old furniture and something like tobacco. "To the one who remembers kindness, even when no one is watching. Thank you, W. Finch." Grace's breath caught. She looked up, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Walter Finch had been watched over by this town for a long time. Eleanor said softly, "But not in the way people think. He's walked these streets for decades." Most stopped noticing after a while. He became part of the background. You didn't see him that way. Grace shook her head. He needed help. That's all." The mayor nodded slowly. "That's all. And yet, you were the only one who did." Grace looked around the diner again. The rain tapped softly against the windows. Mr. Denton sipped from his mug, but didn't lift the newspaper again. Marcy looked like she hadn't blinked in a minute. "I still don't understand," Grace said. "Why me? Why now?" The aide finally spoke, his voice quiet and efficient. "Mr. Finch asked to be observed. Every Friday. Same route. Same time. He wanted to see who would stop, not out of recognition, not out of guilt, just out of instinct." Grace stared at him. "Observed?" Eleanor answered. "He served this town once, built parts of it, protected others. Then he disappeared quietly after something that wasn't his fault. And for years, no one bothered to find out where he went. He gave everything, and when he was no longer useful, we forgot him. So he created a test. He walked and waited." Grace looked back down at the note in her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly. "This doesn't make sense." "It will," Eleanor said. "But you deserve to know what you've stepped into and why it matters." She leaned forward then, her voice low, her words slow. "He left something behind, Grace, and it wasn't money." Grace didn't answer right away. The booth felt smaller suddenly, the air tighter. She looked down at the note again, her fingers pressing into the soft paper, like she might be able to squeeze some sense out of it. The corners were worn, the ink slightly smudged in places where it had been folded and reopened more times than it should have. It didn't feel like a setup. It didn't feel like a prank, but it also didn't feel real. She looked back up at Mayor Briggs, whose face was as unreadable as it was calm. There was no urgency in her expression, no dramatics, just a kind of steady presence, like someone used to saying difficult things without letting the weight show. Grace couldn't tell if that made her feel safer or not. "What do you mean he left something behind?" Grace asked quietly. The mayor didn't answer. Instead, she glanced toward her aide, who gave the faintest nod, then took a small step back. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. "We need you to come with us." It wasn't a command. It wasn't even said with any sense of formality. But something about the way she said it made Grace's stomach tighten. "Come with you where?" she asked. The mayor hesitated, just briefly. "Somewhere nearby, just a short drive. It'll make more sense once you see it." The back of Grace's neck prickled. She could feel the eyes still on her. Mr. Denton hadn't gone back to his paper. Marcy was now pretending to clean something behind the counter, though she hadn't moved more than an inch in 5 minutes. Carl had ducked back into the kitchen, but the swinging door stayed propped open just enough for his shadow to linger. Grace glanced at the clock. It was now 2:46. Her shift had technically ended nearly 3 hours ago, but she'd stayed out of habit, and maybe out of something else. Something unspoken that had kept her planted here even after Walter disappeared into the alley. And now, the mayor of Stone Point was asking her to get in a car with no explanation and trust that this moment made any sense. "I don't really," she started, then stopped. "Why me?" Mayor Briggs looked at her with something softer than she'd shown before. Not sympathy, not manipulation, something closer to understanding. "Because Walter picked you," she said. "Not officially, not in a will or a form or anything that holds up in court. But he chose you. That matters more than most things." Grace felt her breath catch. "But I didn't. I just helped him across the street." "Exactly." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace sat still, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She could feel the stick of dried syrup under her fingernails, the ache in her arches from being on her feet since dawn. She wasn't the kind of person people noticed. She wasn't important. She poured coffee, cleared plates, smiled when she had to, kept to herself when she could. She hadn't done anything special. And yet, the mayor had come for her. Grace looked out the window. The black town car still waited, engine running, a faint trail of exhaust curling up into the gray sky. The rain had thinned to a mist, soft and steady. A plastic grocery bag fluttered against a gutter near the alley across the street. She thought about Walter, about the way he'd said her name, about the way he disappeared without fanfare, like someone who had been preparing to vanish. She looked back at Eleanor. "Okay," she said, her voice quieter than she expected. "I'll come." The mayor gave a small nod, then stood. The aide held the door open as Grace followed them out, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the floor. Behind her, the diner exhaled, soft murmurs rising again, the spell broken but the curiosity lingering. Grace didn't look back. She stepped into the mist, into the waiting car, not knowing what waited for her, only that someone had trusted her to find it. The inside of the town car smelled faintly of leather and something sharper, maybe eucalyptus or one of those high-end air fresheners designed to smell expensive without calling attention to themselves. Grace settled into the back seat cautiously, her damp apron bunched on her lap, unsure whether she should say something or just stare out the rain-blurred window. The door shut beside her with a muffled click, and the silence in the cabin felt different than the silence in the diner, more intentional, less forgiving. The aide slid into the front passenger seat, already tapping at his tablet with quick, rhythmic precision. The screen glowed pale blue against the glass as raindrops rolled down in crooked lines. He didn't speak, didn't look back, just scrolled, typed, scrolled again. Grace could hear the faint vibration of incoming messages. Whoever he was, he seemed to be 5 conversations ahead of everyone in the car. Mayor Briggs sat beside her, her coat folded neatly across her lap, hands resting on top like she had practiced composure since childhood. She didn't look at Grace, just watched the road to the windshield as the car pulled away from the curb. They passed the post office, then the hardware store, then the alley where Grace had last seen Walter disappear. She found herself leaning slightly to get a better view, but the shadows were empty now. Nothing moved except a piece of trash caught in the wind, flapping like a forgotten flag. They turned left at the old courthouse and headed toward the north end of town, the part with government buildings and wide sidewalks no one used. Grace glanced at the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of her own reflection, hair damp and frizzing at the edges, eyes wide in a way she couldn't quite control. She looked tired, but also alert, like someone waiting for the punchline to land. She turned toward the mayor. "Who is he?" she asked. "Walter Finch. What's really going on?" Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She took a slow breath, exhaled, then shifted slightly in her seat as if she'd been expecting the question all along, but had hoped for a little more time. "He was the reason I ran for office," she said quietly. Grace blinked. "I don't understand." Eleanor nodded. "Most people don't. That's part of the problem." The aide in the front seat kept typing, not reacting to conversation, but Grace could feel the shift in tone. Something had just cracked open, just slightly. "Back when I was in college," the mayor continued, "I interned for the city planning department. Just a summer thing. I didn't know anything about zoning laws or infrastructure, but I knew how to take notes and fetch coffee. Walter was already retired by then. Mostly, he'd show up every Thursday like clockwork, wearing a sweater 3 sizes too big, carrying blueprints rolled under his arm like the world was still listening." Grace tilted her head. "Blueprints." "He was an engineer," Eleanor said. "Helped design a good portion of the town's flood system, water treatment layouts, emergency routes. Not flashy things, not things that win awards, but systems that keep people safe. Systems that work so well, most people forget they exist." Grace sat back slowly, trying to reconcile the man with the cane and the grocery bag with someone who had once built things that held the town together. "What happened to him?" she asked. "He tried to warn us," Eleanor said, her voice low, "about a structural issue, a project getting rushed through by people with money and influence. He spoke up, and they made sure he never got invited back." Grace swallowed hard. Outside the car, the buildings blurred as they passed. The town looked different now, as if something behind it had always been hidden in plain sight. "So he just disappeared?" Grace asked. "No," the mayor said. "He stayed. He watched. And apparently he waited." She looked directly at Grace now. "For you?" The car rolled to a stop in front of the municipal building. Town Hall, with its sandstone facade and white columns that always looked more imposing than inviting. The kind of place you drove past without really seeing. Grace had lived in Stone Point her whole life and had only been inside once, for a parking permit she didn't actually need. Now, as the aide stepped out and opened her door, she felt the weight of something larger settle across her shoulders. Inside, the lobby smelled like old paper and rain-soaked carpet. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a flat glow over the front desk and a row of faded chairs lined up against the wall. A clerk behind a glass partition glanced up, then quickly looked back down. Nobody asked for ID. Nobody stopped her. They didn't need to. It was as if they'd been expecting her all along. The aide led her down a quiet corridor lined with bulletin boards and framed photos of ribbon cuttings from decades past. They turned a corner and stopped in front of a closed door with a brass plaque that read Conference Room B. He opened it without ceremony. The room was plain, no windows, just a long table, 8 chairs, and a faint hum from a vent overhead. But what caught Grace's eye immediately was the folder sitting squarely at the center of the table. A manila file, thick and dust-covered, with the words confidential stamped in red across the front. The tab read, Finch, Walter M. She hesitated just inside the doorway. The mayor stepped in behind her and nodded toward the table. "Go ahead," she said softly. Grace walked over, her sneakers muffled against the thin carpet. She pulled out the chair and sat slowly, as if any sudden movement might change the tone of the room. The mayor didn't sit. She remained by the door, arms crossed loosely, watching without intruding. Grace reached out and opened the file. The first page was a black and white photo, yellowed with age. A younger version of Walter stood in front of a large surveyor's map, pointing towards something just off frame. His hair was dark, neatly combed, and his eyes, though still deeply set, held a sharpness she recognized. He looked like a man with a plan mid-sentence, caught in the act of explaining something no one else had seen yet. Underneath the photo were documents, official letters, handwritten notes, maps, diagrams. Some were stamped with city seals, others with private engineering firm logos. There were council meeting transcripts, clipped newspaper articles, and memos typed on thin, translucent paper. Grace sifted through them carefully. One article was from 1986. Town engineer raises red flags on McKinley flood barrier proposal. She scanned the first few paragraphs. Walter had spoken out about a proposed shortcut in construction, warning that omitting certain drainage reinforcements could result in long-term structural weakness. He'd urged the city to wait, to test, to do it right. The following page was a memo from a developer's attorney, claiming Walter's unfounded accusations had delayed vital progress and cost the city thousands. A few pages later came his resignation letter, brief and formal, with only one line of explanation. Asterisk, I can no longer serve a process that prioritizes speed over safety. Asterisk. Grace looked up. The mayor was still watching her, her face unreadable. This is a lot, Grace said. Eleanor nodded. He walked away, not because he wanted to, but because no one listened. He kept quiet after that, never pushed, never sought attention. But he never stopped paying attention. Grace flipped to the final section of the file. Inside was a recent handwritten note. Dated only 6 months ago, it read, asterisk, if anything happens, the town won't remember me, but maybe one person will. Someone who doesn't need a reason to help. Someone like her. Asterisk. Beneath the note, tucked in the last sleeve of the folder, was a photo printed on regular paper. It was grainy, taken from a street camera. In it, she saw herself, half-turned, holding Walter's arm as they crossed the street, from just a few hours ago. Grace stared at it for a long time. He was still watching, she asked. Eleanor's voice was quiet. No, he was waiting. Grace kept flipping through the file, her fingers grazing the edges of time as the pages slipped past. A photo from 1964 stopped her, black and white, cracked at the corners. Walter was young then, maybe in his 20s. He stood beside a rusted bridge out by Langley Creek, one foot up on a concrete slab, pointing toward the water. A surveyor's rod leaned against his shoulder. His expression was focused, eyes narrowed against the sun. Behind him, 2 men in suits looked bored, their arms crossed as if waiting for him to finish. The caption, written in faded blue pen, read, Langley Project Survey, March 1964. She turned the page. Another photograph, this one from 1981. Walter again, but older now, his hair gray at the sides, shoulders slightly slumped. He was holding a child's hand, some public event. It seemed a ribbon in the background. The mayor at the time, a man named Deacon Wilkes, stood at a podium, giving a speech. Grace recognized the corner of the community center in the distance. The photo was candid. Walter wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the child beside him, smiling faintly, almost to himself. The next page was a formal city document, a commendation from the Office of Emergency Management dated July 1999. It read, asterisk, for acts of clear-headed decision-making and personal bravery during the Stone Point chemical spill evacuation, Walter M. Finch is hereby recognized for heroism in the service of public safety. Asterisk. Grace remembered that incident. She'd been 3 years old. Her mother used to talk about it. How people fled their homes, how a quiet man with a clipboard had knocked on every door in their block, making sure no one was left behind. They never knew his name, just a guy from City Works. It had been Walter. There were more pages now, brittle and yellowed, typed reports, letters between departments, copies of budgets and planning proposals, most with Walter's notes in the margins, careful handwriting, often underlining phrases like potential runoff risk, or asterisk, lack of pedestrian access. Asterisk, a meticulous man. A man who had tried to be heard. Tucked into a protective sleeve at the back of the folder was an envelope, sealed and marked with a date. May 7th, 5 years ago. On the front, in ink that hadn't faded, was her name. Not Grace Miller. Just to the one who stops. Her breath caught. She looked up at the mayor, who was now seated at the edge of the table, hands folded. "You've seen this before?" Grace asked. Eleanor shook her head. Only the outside of it. Walter left instructions in his will. Said the letter inside was for someone else to determine. That we'd know when we saw her. Grace hesitated, then carefully broke the seal. The paper inside was thick, folded 3 times. She unfolded it. "If you're reading this, then I didn't misjudge you. Asterisk, I used to think the town needed someone loud. A voice, a protest. But I was wrong. The ones who change things are the ones who do the right thing even when no one's looking. The quiet ones. The ones who stop. Asterisk. Asterisk, I watched this town grow. I watched it cut corners and forget people. But I never stopped believing it could be better. That someone would come along and remind it how. Asterisk. Asterisk, that day you helped me. I wasn't testing you. I didn't plan it. I was just tired. And you stopped. No cameras. No ceremony. Just kindness. Asterisk. You reminded me that good still lives here. Asterisk, if they brought you here, is because they saw what I saw. That's enough for me. Asterisk. Asterisk, do what feels right. The rest will follow. Asterisk. The letter was unsigned. It didn't need to be. Grace folded it slowly and placed it back in the envelope. The mayor said nothing. The room was still. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the street still shimmered in the light. She looked down at the folder again, at the decades of warnings, of plans, of ignored truths, at the man who hadn't stopped believing in a town that forgot him. Grace didn't know what came next, but somehow she knew she wasn't going back to the diner. Not yet. The chair creaked as Grace leaned back, her eyes still locked on the closed folder in front of her. She hadn't spoken since finishing the letter. She didn't quite know how. The quiet had a weight to it, dense, expectant. Mayor Eleanor Briggs sat across the table, hands folded, elbows resting lightly on the edge of the wood. She looked not like a politician now, but like someone remembering something they'd nearly forgotten. He was never supposed to be invisible, she said finally. Walter, Grace looked up. The mayor nodded toward the folder. When I was a kid, I used to see him around town hall, always carrying papers, talking to no one. He never raised his voice, just moved through the halls like part of the building. She paused, then leaned forward. Back in 1963, Walter Finch was the youngest civil engineer ever hired by the Stone Point Planning Commission. He had just come from Pittsburgh, Carnegie Tech, top of his class. People said he could look at a map and already see what would happen 20 years later. Roads, water, time. He saw how everything flowed. Grace's brow furrowed. Then why did no one know his name? The mayor offered a tired smile. Because he never let them. He designed the flood barrier system in 1966. Most people think the river wall and drainage tunnels are just leftovers from the WPA or some state-funded thing. But that was Walter. He worked through 2 rainy seasons to finish it. There were delays, of course. Contractors wanted shortcuts. Budget meetings got tense. Walter refused to bend. He said, "If I do it wrong, someone else pays the price." Grace said nothing. She pictured him standing in those old photographs, a slight figure against scaffolding and wet concrete. Not the frail man she helped across the street, but someone strong, precise, steady. In 1969, the mayor continued. He filed a report predicting what would happen if the town kept building into the marshland north of Ridgeview. He said the soil wasn't stable, that any serious rain would flood the lower neighborhoods. He wasn't wrong. That report's still in the archives. But no one listened. Grace looked out the window behind the mayor, where a sliver of the river could be seen bending between buildings. Eleanor's voice softened. After that, Walter resigned. No grand exit. Just a letter. He didn't fight. He just stepped out of public view, took a quiet maintenance job at the post office. People forgot he had ever been more than the man who changed the lights and patched the roof. Grace folded her arms, still struggling to match the man she had helped with the one described now. Why didn't anyone say anything? Because people like Walter don't make noise. And towns like this, we only remember the loud ones, the ones with podiums and plans, not the ones who actually built the foundation we're all standing on. She let that sit for a moment, her gaze drifting to the letters still on the table. He came to every town hall meeting for 20 years, sat in the back, never spoke, just listened, took notes. Then one day he stopped coming. Grace spoke quietly, and no one noticed? The mayor met her eyes. I noticed. I was 14 the first time I saw him in the back row, writing in that little brown notebook. I thought he was a janitor, but he was always there, until he wasn't. When I first ran for office, I found a letter in my campaign inbox. No return address, no signature, just a note. If you're serious about change, look at the river map. It's still broken. I didn't know what it meant. I do now. They both sat in silence for a while, as if the room itself had to process the weight of what had been said. Grace finally asked, "Why bring me here?" The mayor's answer was quiet. Because today, someone saw him. Not just the old man with the cane, but the person who once held up this town with nothing but plans and warnings. Grace nodded slowly. Walter Finch had lived in the margins, uncelebrated, unthanked, but not unseen. Not anymore. The mayor reached into the folder again and pulled out a smaller envelope. This one yellowed along the edges, the flap already open but still neatly folded over. She handed it to Grace, who took it cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper, thinner than the others. A resignation letter, typed in clean lines with a typewriter ribbon that had begun to fade with time. Dated October 11th, 1971. Signed, Walter E. Finch. Grace scanned the letter. It was brief, respectful, a statement of gratitude, not bitterness. "It has been an honor to serve the town of Stone Point," it read. "Due to personal circumstances and irreconcilable professional differences, I hereby submit my resignation, effective immediately. My intention is not to cause disruption, but to remove myself from the equation in hopes that the town's projects can proceed without further distraction." There was no explanation of the conflict, no finger-pointing, just quiet departure. Grace looked up. "What happened?" Mayor Briggs leaned back in her chair, hands resting in her lap. There was a permit, a housing development up on the North Slope, Meadow Ridge. They were calling it. Developers said it would bring in jobs and tax revenue. Walter was assigned to review the foundational plans. He flagged it immediately. Why? Because the land was unstable. The runoff patterns from the hills above would have pushed water straight into new development during storm season. He said the soil core samples were inconsistent, that the slope was prone to saturation. He submitted a report with his recommendation: deny the permit until more testing could be done. Grace set the letter down. And they didn't like that. "No," the mayor said simply. They didn't. There were backroom meetings. Pressure from the mayor at the time. They accused Walter of fabricating data to delay construction, claimed he was trying to sabotage progress. Was he? No. The reports were accurate. But politics, they don't run on truth. They run on momentum. Grace let out a breath. What did they do? They opened a formal investigation. He was suspended for 2 months. During that time, they approved the permit and broke ground. When the review finally cleared him of any wrongdoing, the damage had already been done. Did he come back? The mayor shook her head. He didn't even try. Just turned in that letter and disappeared. No press. No rebuttal. He went back to fixing lights and sweeping floors. Grace looked down at the typed words again. There was something about the tone that unsettled her, not defeat, but withdrawal, like someone choosing silence over survival. "It flooded, didn't it?" she asked. "Yes." 3 years later, a spring storm brought more rain than the new drains could handle. 14 houses were damaged. One family had to be airlifted out, and still no one said his name. The mayor's jaw tightened. The incident report listed design miscalculations. No mention of Walter's warnings. The council called it an unforeseeable natural event. It wasn't. Grace stood from the table and walked slowly toward the tall windows that overlooked the edge of downtown. In the distance, she could just make out the edge of the slope, the curve of Meadow Ridge under a sheet of late afternoon light. They erased him, she said quietly. They ignored him, Eleanor corrected. We erased him. The words hovered between them, too heavy to move. Grace turned back toward the table. So why now? Why tell me all of this? The mayor took a moment to answer. Because today he was seen, and that matters. Because when someone like Walter reemerges after 50 years of silence, it isn't random, it's deliberate. And because you stopped, you didn't know who he was. You didn't ask. You just helped. And maybe that's what he was waiting for. Grace felt the chair behind her and sat again, slowly. She didn't know what to say. It was strange. She had spent years serving people coffee, wiping down booths, listening to half-finished stories from strangers at the counter. And yet, nothing had ever felt this real. Walter Finch had been buried, without being gone. Erased not by time, but by silence. And now, for reasons she still didn't understand, that silence had been broken, with nothing more than a helping hand at a crosswalk. The envelope was thick, heavier than it looked. Grace turned it over in her hands, noticing how carefully it had been sealed. Edges folded with precision, the flap lined with faded wax stamp that had long since cracked. On the front, in handwriting that shook slightly but still held form, were the words, "To the person who helps me when I'm no longer worth helping." The room was quiet. The mayor didn't speak. Her aide stood respectfully by the door, not tapping on his tablet for once, not even glancing down. Grace looked at the words again. They didn't feel like a label. They felt like a memory still waiting to be made. Or maybe one trying not to disappear. She looked up at the mayor. What does this mean? Eleanor Briggs, usually composed to the point of appearing cold, sat forward and rested her elbows on the polished conference table. Her voice lowered, not for secrecy, but out of something closer to reverence. 5 years ago, Walter came here. Quiet, just like he left. He brought that letter in a sealed envelope and asked for it to be kept safe. Not opened, not tampered with, just protected. And he gave it to the town to be held until someone showed him kindness. Unprompted, without recognition or exchange. He said, "Someday I'll need help again. Real help. And I won't be anyone worth noticing by then. But someone will. And if they do, give them this." Grace didn't know how to respond. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Her fingers tightened around the envelope, as if the weight of it might suddenly shift. "I don't understand," she finally said. "I didn't do anything. I just helped him across the street." The mayor gave a small smile, one of those rare expressions that didn't reach her lips so much as settle in her eyes. Maybe that's exactly why it matters. Grace thought back to the moment. The wind had been cold. Walter's bag had torn a little at the bottom, and he'd carried it like he was used to things falling apart in his hands. No one else had stopped. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, just instinct. She didn't even remember saying much to him beyond his name and whether he was okay. But he'd smiled, hadn't he? A real one, like it meant more to him than it should have. She looked down at the letter again. "Do I open it now?" "That's up to you," the mayor said. "But I think he meant for it to be personal." Grace nodded and slipped a finger under the flap. It opened cleanly. The paper inside was aged but sturdy, folded once down the middle, then again. She unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the edges. The handwriting was the same, thin and deliberate. Each line written in black ink, not typed, and with enough pressure to leave faint imprints on the back of the page. She began to read. Asterisk if you're holding this letter. Then I was right. Someone saw me. Someone stopped. Asterisk. Asterisk, I have not been an easy man to know, nor a particularly useful one these last few decades. I have lived among buildings I once helped design, under bridges I helped keep from collapsing, walking streets I once stood proudly to measure and mark. But names fade, And people forget the hands that built what they now use. That's fair. Time works that way. Asterisk. Asterisk, but kindness, that stays. Even when the person offering it doesn't know why. Asterisk. Asterisk, you didn't have to help me. But you did. You made me feel like I still belonged to this place, even if only for a moment. And that is something I haven't felt in a very long time. Asterisk. Asterisk, this letter is not a reward. It's not a confession, either. It's a thank you. The only kind I know how to give. Enclosed, you'll find something I once promised myself I'd pass on only to someone who reminded me that decency still exists in small places. Asterisk. Asterisk, open the second envelope. It's not much, but it's yours now. Asterisk. Taped to the back of the letter was a smaller envelope, plain white, no name, just sealed shut. Grace looked at it, her hands trembling now, not from fear but from something much harder to name. She hadn't done anything grand, hadn't fixed anything or saved anyone, but here she was, holding a man's final gesture, something he'd written without knowing who it was for, trusting that someday someone would care enough to deserve it. For years, Walter Finch had walked the same path through the same alley behind the post office. His steps were slow, but not only from age. He lingered, sometimes pausing near the dumpster where the brick wall broke into a narrow view of the town square. Other times, he sat on the overturned milk crate tucked behind a leaning fence, where no one noticed him unless they were looking for something they'd lost. He didn't smoke, didn't feed the birds. He just sat, hat in hand, plastic grocery bag resting between his feet like a tether to the present. Always alone, always still, and people passed him. Every day, they walked quickly, distracted, on their phones, talking to someone else, pushing strollers, dragging toddlers, rushing to catch the mail carrier or find their cars before the meter ran out. Some looked in his direction and quickly away. A few offered thin smiles, not quite reaching their eyes. But mostly he was invisible. Just another old man in a town where old men were everywhere and none of them seemed to matter anymore. But Walter wasn't waiting. He was watching. It had started almost 2 decades ago. After the last hospital visit, the last letter from the city denying him reinstatement. The final conversation with his brother that had ended with too much silence and not enough forgiveness. Something inside him had settled. Not broken, just hardened. He didn't want to be known anymore. But he wanted to know something. Was kindness still out there, unprompted? Would anyone stop if there was nothing to gain from it? So he began a routine. He picked the same alley because it cut between the town's busier streets and the lesser-used corners where time moved more slowly. He always carried a single bag with a single item inside, sometimes a can of soup, sometimes a worn paperback from a used bin at the library, just enough to give him a reason to be there. He made his movements intentional. Sometimes he let the bag slip. Sometimes he leaned a little too far forward on his cane, like his balance was failing. Nothing dramatic, nothing staged, just enough to see if anyone noticed, if anyone would help. Most didn't, not out of cruelty, just busyness. Some were kind with their eyes, but kept walking. Some offered apologies from a distance, already late for wherever they were going. Others never looked at all. He didn't judge them. He didn't expect anything, really, but he kept watching. Years passed this way. Faces changed. Teenagers grew into parents. Shop owners rotated. He learned the rhythm of the town better than any calendar or clock. He recognized patterns, who always took the shortcut, who walked with their heads down, who made space for others on the sidewalk, and who didn't. But none stopped. Until that day, the rain had started just before noon. A slow, soaking drizzle that turned gutters into rivers and umbrellas into sails. Walter hadn't brought one. On purpose. He wanted to see how many people would hurry past the dripping, wobbling man at the crosswalk. He waited. Cars passed, slow but not stopping. People under awnings stared at their watches. A woman with 2 children in tow crossed on the far side, without glancing his way. And then she appeared. Grace. He noticed her before she noticed him. She wasn't in a rush, but she didn't look like she had extra time either. Her diner apron was still tied around her waist, smudged from the morning's work. Her sneakers were soaked through. Her hair was frizzed at the edges, probably from the kitchen steam mixing with the damp air. But she saw him. She hesitated only once. Then she stepped forward. No questions. No sighs. She just took his elbow and walked with him like she'd done 100 times. She didn't even seem to register what she was getting. She asked his name, not out of politeness, but as if it truly mattered. Walter had nodded, feeling the quiet click of something shift inside his chest. It wasn't joy, not quite, more like a long-held breath finally released. After she helped him across, she smiled, said goodbye, and walked off like it meant nothing. But to Walter, it was everything. He didn't follow her, didn't stop her. He turned down the alley as he always did. But that afternoon, for the first time in all the years he'd sat and watched, he knew it was over. The test was done, and someone had passed. The conference room remained quiet except for the steady hum of the air vent above and the soft click of the mayor's heels as she paced. Grace sat at the long table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, still unsure if this was some elaborate mistake or a strange misunderstanding playing out in real time. But Mayor Briggs didn't seem confused. She was calm, deliberate, focused. On the table now lay a series of printed surveillance images, spread out like a timeline. They were black and white, slightly grainy and labeled with dates in the lower corners. Different years, different angles, but always the same alley. This was April 14th, 2017. The mayor pointed to one image. Walter was there, standing just before the alley's entrance, cane in one hand, grocery bag in the other. He wasn't looking at the camera. He never did. He always faced away or toward the crosswalk. Grace leaned forward, squinting. There were other people in the frame, too. A woman in a business suit walking briskly, a man on a bike swerving past, a group of teenagers sharing earbuds as they passed without turning their heads. No one stopped. The next photo was from 2019. Same alley, same man, slightly different posture, but unmistakably Walter. The scene around him had changed. A newer mailbox on the corner, a fresh coat of paint on the bench nearby. But his presence was constant, as if frozen in the same quiet ritual. Every Friday, the mayor said quietly, between 11:30 and noon, for 10 years. Grace looked up at her. Why? Briggs met her eyes, then sat down across from her again. She pulled one last image from the stack and placed it directly in front of Grace. Today's photo, Walter at the edge of the crosswalk in the rain. And beside him, Grace, head turned toward him, one hand gently holding his elbow. The mayor tapped the photo. You're the first. Grace stared at it. It didn't look like much. Two soaked figures on a curb. No fanfare, no drama. Just a tiny, unnoticed moment captured from above. And yet, she felt the weight in it now, the years it had taken to lead up to it. A decade of people walking by, a pattern unbroken until this very morning. I don't understand, she said again, softer this time. Why would he do that? Why not ask for help if he needed it? The mayor didn't answer right away. She sat back, her fingers drumming lightly against the edge of the table. Finally, she said, Walter was deliberate. After everything that happened, his resignation, the investigation, the years of silence, he pulled away from public life, but he never really left the town. He just became part of the background, a constant no one noticed. But he was waiting for someone? Grace asked. No, the mayor said. He wasn't waiting. He was watching, testing something. Maybe us, maybe himself. Grace looked down at the photo again. All those people, they didn't even see him. They saw him, the mayor replied. They just didn't stop. Grace pressed her palms to the table and slowly stood. Her mind ran back over the morning. The crosswalk, the rain, Walter's faint smile, the way he'd said her name like it mattered. It hadn't felt like anything big at the time. Just a moment, a small kindness in a quiet town. But now it felt like a key in a lock that had rusted shut years ago. Mayor Briggs rose too. She picked up the photographs, carefully sliding them back into a folder. Walter didn't ask us to find him. He didn't leave instructions. But he left that letter, and he walked that path. Every week. I think he wanted someone to show up, not because they had to, but because they chose to. And I did, Grace said, not quite believing herself. You did. The mayor nodded. And now, for reasons we still don't fully understand, he's given us something. A signal. A message. Maybe a burden. Maybe a gift. Grace stared out the narrow conference room window, past the courthouse across the street, and down toward the alley she now saw with different eyes. Something had shifted in her chest. The kind of shift that doesn't feel real until much later, when the world has gone quiet again and you have time to feel its echo. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew, without question, that she had broken the pattern, and someone finally had noticed. Grace sat on the edge of the cushioned chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the soft flicker of fluorescent light humming overhead. The folder with the surveillance photos was now closed, resting between her and the mayor like a sealed question neither of them could quite answer. Grace's reflection in the darkened conference room window was faint, but she could see the confusion on her face, the slight pinch of her brow, the way her lips pressed together, as if trying to hold in the flood of questions that had started building the moment she saw Walter's name on that file. She turned toward Mayor Briggs again, voice low and uncertain. I still don't get it. Why me? The mayor didn't answer right away. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, hands folded. Because you didn't need a reason. That doesn't make sense, Grace said, shaking her head. I'm not anyone important. I didn't do anything that anyone else wouldn't have done. But no one else did, the mayor replied gently. Grace looked down at her shoes, scuffed white soles, a coffee stain on one for where a cup had slipped earlier that morning. Her apron was still folded over the back of her chair, the smell of breakfast grease still clinging to the fabric. She hadn't even gotten a chance to change, hadn't planned for any of this. I serve pancakes and refill mugs, she muttered. I don't know anything about people like Walter Finch or whatever test he was doing. Briggs softened her tone. Grace. He didn't need a scientist or a politician. He needed a human being. Just one. Who saw him. The words landed somewhere in the middle of Grace's chest, where they stayed, heavy but not painful. She blinked, unsure if it was frustration or humility tightening her throat. Why now, she asked. After all these years? Why was today the day he decided it mattered? Briggs leaned back in her chair, eyes unfocused for a moment, as if searching for the answer in the ceiling tiles. Maybe he always knew the day would come. Maybe he didn't. But I don't think it was about timing. I think it was about someone breaking the pattern. Grace thought about the alley again, the gray light, the way Walter had stood just slightly off-center, like he was making himself visible without demanding attention. 1,000 people could have walked by, maybe they had, and she'd been the one to stop. I don't even remember thinking about it, Grace admitted. I just saw him struggling, and I don't know. It felt wrong not to help. That's exactly why. Briggs said quietly. There was again that phrase, as if her smallness, her ordinariness, was the very thing that mattered most. Grace ran a hand through her damp hair, fingers catching in a knot near the back of her head. I'm still not sure what you want to do with all this. We don't want anything, the mayor said. Walter left us no instructions, no requests, just a letter, the pattern, and the person who broke it. That's you. That's all we know. She felt a flicker of guilt, irrational and strange, as if she had stumbled into a room meant for someone else and been told to sit at the head of the table. I'm not brave. I'm not wise. I didn't even do it for any big reason. You didn't do it for a reason, Briggs said, and that's what made it real. They sat in silence for a few long seconds. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Somewhere down the hallway, a door creaked open and shut. Grace could hear her own breath in quiet, steady and unsure. I think you should read the letter, the mayor said, not because it holds some grand secret, but because it was meant for someone who did what you did, for someone who stopped. Grace nodded slowly. She didn't feel ready, but she wasn't sure she ever would. And maybe, she thought, readiness wasn't what mattered. Maybe it never had been. Grace hesitated, the envelope resting lightly between her fingers, its edges yellowed and sealed with a small piece of tape that had begun to curl. Her name, her full name, was written in faint blue ink on the back. The handwriting wasn't the same as the rest. This had been added later, more recent. The ink bled slightly at the edge of the letters, as if written by a hand that trembled. She looked at the mayor. "You said there was just one letter." "I thought there was," Briggs replied, voice hushed. "But the aide found that second one tucked between the pages after you stepped out." Grace slid a finger beneath the seal and slowly opened it. The paper inside was lined, like something torn from a spiral notebook. It was folded twice, once horizontally and again lengthwise. She opened it gently, revealing a page covered in uneven handwriting that sloped downward, as though written by someone whose strength had come and gone in the span of a sentence. The first lines read like something out of a forgotten journal. "To the one who stops, not out of duty, not for glory, not even for kindness, but simply because they choose to." Grace read the line again, slower this time, feeling something stir in the space between her ribs. Below it was a drawing, rough, done in pen. A simple street grid, a few landmark shapes. The church, the post office, and then, just off to one side, an X mark behind what looked like the edge of the woods that bordered the east side of town. Coordinates were scrawled beneath it. They were precise, too specific for someone just sketching a memory. The writing continued beneath them, a message shorter than the first. Asterisk, this is where I stopped being seen. But something was left there, something worth returning for. Asterisk. At the bottom of the page, a date had been added, just 3 weeks earlier. Grace traced the final curve of the last letter with her eyes. There was a pause in the pen stroke, a mark where the pen had bled a little too long on the paper, as if Walter had hesitated before signing his name. But there was no signature, no closing, just the writing itself, folded carefully, quietly waiting to be opened when the right person came along. She looked up, the letter shaking slightly in her hand. "What is this?" The mayor leaned closer. "That," she said, "is something no one at town hall has ever seen before. We didn't even know Walter had written anything else." "But he knew my name," Grace said. "He wrote it. That's my name on the envelope." The mayor's face softened. "I think he wrote it after today, after you helped him. But that was only 2 hours ago." Briggs gave a faint nod. "Sometimes 2 hours is enough." Grace's mind was racing. The map, the coordinates, the line about not being seen. She remembered the alley, the slope of his shoulders, the slight turn of his head after she'd helped him cross. Like he'd memorized a moment, tucked it into his coat pocket along with the rest of his secrets. "He left something out there," Grace said slowly, eyes still on the page. "It would seem so," the mayor replied. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this." "I don't either," Briggs said. "But I think you're the only one who's supposed to find out." Grace folded the letter again, more carefully this time, smoothing each crease as if preserving something fragile. She slid it back into the envelope and held it in both hands, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, not in mass, but in meaning. She wasn't sure what Walter had left behind, but she knew, without question, that it was meant for her. And somehow, in the quiet curve of that shaky handwriting, she had just become part of something that had waited a long, long time to be found. The wind picked up as they reached the edge of town, where the main road narrowed into cracked pavement and power lines traced overhead like a forgotten sketch. Beyond the community park, and just past the old creek bridge, a squat concrete building stood behind a rusted chain-link fence. It was low and gray, tucked between two aging utility poles, half swallowed by vines that curled up the corners of its walls. The sign above the door read, "Municipal Substation, Authorized Personnel Only." Gray stood in front of the gate, holding the folded map in one hand and the small, rust-flecked key in the other. She looked at the lock. It was an old padlock, dulled by years of sun and storm. The mayor's aide, still tapping at his tablet, lingered a few steps behind her. Eleanor Briggs stood silently beside her, watching with an unreadable expression. "This place hasn't been used in years," Briggs said softly. "We stopped storing municipal records here sometime in the early 2000s. It's mostly forgotten now." Grace crouched, inserted the key, and turned it, There was a distinct click, sharper than she expected. The lock gave way like it had just been oiled, not left to seize up in elements. She pushed the gate open. It groaned on its hinges. The air inside the fence perimeter smelled of damp earth and concrete. Wild grasses had grown up through the cracks in the pavement. Grace stepped forward, her shoes crunching on loose gravel, and approached the heavy steel door of the substation. It had no windows, just a dented metal plate and a narrow slit for mail or documents, long sealed shut. She tried the key again. It slid in, caught, and with a firm turn, the door creaked open. Inside, the room was musty and dim. A single fluorescent light flickered to life overhead, surprising them. It bathed the space in a dull blue haze, revealing rows of dusty shelving, filing cabinets, and outdated electrical panels lining the walls. In the center of the room sat a large, rust-colored metal cabinet with a padlock identical to the one at the gate. It was bolted to the floor, the paint peeling along its edges. Grace stepped cautiously toward it. The room felt heavier than it should have, like the air itself carried the weight of long-forgotten things. Briggs didn't follow her in. She remained just inside the threshold, her eyes scanning the space, hands clasped loosely in front of her. Grace examined the second lock. No keyhole this time, just a sliding latch and a rusted metal tab that had long since loosened from its screws. With a slow breath, she tugged. The latch gave after a moment's resistance. The cabinet door swung open with a reluctant groan. Inside was a wooden crate, perhaps 2 feet wide and a foot deep. It didn't look like town property. It looked older, handcrafted. The top was marked with a faded stencil, WF 1967. She glanced back toward the mayor, who gave a small nod. Grace lifted the crate, surprised at its weight, and set it down on a nearby table. It didn't rattle, no metallic clinking, just solid weight and silence. She hesitated, then opened the lid. Inside, carefully arranged and wrapped in oilcloth, were dozens of notebooks, each one hand-labeled by year. 1965, 1966, 1967. They continued in order, each thick with yellowed pages. Beneath them, tucked into a smaller box within the crate, were several rolled blueprints and a stack of typewritten reports. At the very bottom, pressed flat beneath a final layer of cloth, was a photograph. Grace pulled it out gently. It showed a much younger Walter, standing beside what looked like a collapsed embankment. In the background, floodwater, people on rooftops, and sandbags in disarray. Scribbled on the back in blue pen were the words, "Before the design, before they listened." Grace didn't speak. She only stared. The aide finally broke the silence. "These aren't just records. This is evidence. Data, documentation." Briggs moved closer now, slowly, like she was approaching something sacred. This is what he buried, what he preserved, and what no one ever came back for. Grace looked down at the notebooks again. Walter had carried these secrets for decades, not to hide them, but to protect them, waiting, it seemed, for someone who would unlock the door, not because they were asked, but because they chose to. The air inside the substation had shifted. Now that the crate sat open on the table, something about the room felt less abandoned. It was as if the stillness had always been deliberate, a pause between breaths, not a silence born neglect. Grace stood motionless for a long moment, then turned slowly toward the far wall. Behind a panel half obscured by a rusted filing cabinet, she noticed a faint pulsing glow, not bright, but unmistakable. A line of small, rectangular lights blinked one by one along an old control console. Green, yellow, green again. The casing was scratched, the switches worn smooth at the edges, but the equipment was on, still operational. Grace stepped toward it, brushing aside a cobweb as she approached. Her fingers hovered over the worn dials. Each switch was labeled by hand, some in pencil, others in faded marker. Pump A, south intake. Westgate relay. All familiar in the way a town map might be, but more intimate, more precise. In the upper corner of the console, a black binder rested neatly on a hook. The spine read, Flood Override Manual. The label was written in block letters on yellowed masking tape. Grace reached for it and opened to the first page. It wasn't government-issued. There were no logos, no formal seals. Just Walter's handwriting, rows of neatly written notes, diagrams, and system checks. The first line on the page was dated March 8, 1986. Asterisk, install bypass fuse on Zone 3. West intake tested. Manual gate override confirmed. Asterisk, the notes continued, page after page. Some entries were short. Others ran paragraphs long, detailing structural observations, mechanical wear, rainfall patterns, pressure readings. Tucked in the back were sketches, emergency evacuation routes, even handwritten logs of past flood surges with commentary. One entry simply read, City Council rejected inspection request. No one came. Maintained south pump manually. Grace felt her breath catch. This wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't a man clinging to the past. It was upkeep, sustained, relentless, necessary. She flipped through more pages and paused when she reached the year 2007. A note had been underlined twice. Asterisk, public sensor network offline after vandalism. Switched to analog backups. Daily monitoring resumed. Asterisk, below that, a set of initials. W\F. Briggs stood at her shoulder now, her voice low. We assumed all this had been decommissioned, transferred to the new system in the early 2000s. But the upgrades only ever went through on paper. The funding never came. Grace turned to face her. So he kept it going. Briggs nodded. Quietly, alone. They looked around the room, at the humming gauges, the slow blink of aging lights, the analog dials still ticking. A system forgotten by its designers, ignored by its beneficiaries, and quietly maintained by the man no one noticed. How was he even getting in here all this time? Grace asked. He had access, the mayor said. Before his resignation, Walter oversaw infrastructure keys, facility maintenance. No one ever reclaimed them. He just kept coming. The aide wandered to another terminal and examined a series of water level indicators. This data, it's recent, like updated within the last week. He was still logging everything. Briggs stepped closer to the table. It's all here. The system's still functional. And if it is, then this isn't just a time capsule. It's our lifeline. Grace nodded slowly, and no one knew. The mayor didn't answer. She reached for a switch labeled test signal, Eastgate, and flipped it gently. A corresponding light lit up green on a secondary panel across the room. The system responded, not with drama, not with clamor, but with quiet, persistent efficiency, just as it always had. She could almost see him here. Walter, moving through the space with the care of a man, not preserving history, but preserving people, not with speeches or declarations, but with wire, ink, and patience. His silence had not been withdrawal. It had been vigilance. Grace looked back at the binder in her hands. The pages had grown heavy, not because of their weight, but because of the truth they carried. He hadn't stopped working for this town. He'd just stopped expecting anyone to notice. The light filtering through the narrow window above the substation door had changed. It was softer now, late afternoon light, the kind that stretches shadows and quiets everything. Grace sat at the metal table, the binder still open in front of her, her fingertips lightly resting on the edge of the page as if afraid the words might vanish if she moved too fast. The mayor stood by the humming console, her expression unreadable. It doesn't make sense, she said after a long silence. All these years, we thought the flood systems were automated, maintained by the city's utility contract. The aide didn't look up from the monitor. There's no digital uplink, no sensor handshake. This isn't even connected to the central server. Grace turned another page. The handwriting hadn't changed much over the decades. Still blocky and careful. Walter had written as if every word might be the last someone would read. Notes about rainfall, tide changes, soil absorption rates. Every Friday, just after lunch, he'd walk the perimeter of the old flood barrier system and record his observations by hand. There were no skips, no lapses. The aide finally stepped back and crossed his arms. The contractor pulled out in 2004. The sensors were never activated. And from the logs, it looks like Walter never missed a day. He picked up where they left off. Grace leaned back in the chair. No one paid him. No one asked him. No, Briggs said. They didn't. They stood in the center of a quiet truth. A man had given up decades of his life to protect people who didn't know his name anymore. While the world moved on, upgraded, restructured, and forgot, he remained. Checking valves, adjusting pressure gauges, logging temperature swings and humidity levels with the same discipline he'd shown in the 60s. Grace imagined the town's last big storm. She remembered it vaguely. 5 or 6 years ago, roads turned to rivers. Power lines sagged under the weight of the wind. But the floodwaters never reached Main Street. People had credited the elevation a stroke of luck, a shift in the storm's path. No one had mentioned Walter. How does something like this get lost? Grace finally asked. Briggs exhaled through her nose. Budget cuts. Staff turnover. Paperwork passed along until it dies in a drawer. We assumed it had been transferred and forgotten. No one double-checked. No one thought to. And he never said anything? He tried. Once. The mayor nodded toward a manila folder set off to the side. Grace pulled it closer. Inside were 2 letters. One addressed to the city council in 2006. The other, from 2012, written to the mayor at the time. Both requested inspection of the flood control systems. Both outlined concerns about deteriorating infrastructure. Both had been stamped as received. Neither had any follow-up. Grace stared at them, a slow frustration curling behind her ribs. He didn't just maintain it, she said. He kept it alive. If he hadn't, Briggs finished the sentence for her. We would have lost the west side of town 5 years ago. They let that settle. Grace stood and walked back to the blinking panel. She pressed one of the test switches again, this time for the north inlet. Another green light. The entire system was running on decades-old wiring, a single generator, and one man's faith that someone still needed it. She looked at the mayor. Why me? Briggs didn't answer right away. Then she said, maybe because you saw him. Grace blinked. What do you mean? He stood there for years, Briggs said quietly. Same corner, same bag, same limp. We all pass him. Dozens of us. Hundreds. But you stopped. Grace didn't speak. The sound of the substation filled the space. Gentle whirring. The faint hum of electricity flowing through old wires. The rhythmic pulse of warning lights still doing their job. She could almost hear Walter in it. Not his voice, but his intention, his presence. She ran her hand across the top of the console, the metal warm from hours of operation. She thought about the worn shoes Walter had been wearing, the plastic bag in his hand, the careful, deliberate steps he'd taken across the wet street that morning. He had never needed help crossing the street. He just needed to know someone still would. The box was small enough to be tucked under one arm, but when Grace lifted the lid, it felt like opening a vault. Inside, a stack of bound notebooks sat neatly in rows, their spines numbered by year. Each one had Walter's name written at the top in his steady, square handwriting. The covers were frayed, and the edges had curled slightly with age, but they were clean, reverent, like someone had taken care to preserve them. She picked up the one marked 1997. The cover was soft from handling, the corners reinforced with yellowing tape. She opened to a random page in April and began to read. April 14 to 3:40 p.m. Noticed minor sediment buildup near South Inlet number 2. Cleared obstruction with hand tool. Water pressure normalized within 17 minutes. Logged secondary flow levels. No public risk. The next page. April 21 to 4:10 p.m. Unusual surge in downstream gauge. Suspect runoff from construction site. Alerted town office. No response. Manually opened secondary channel for 2 hours. Pressure stabilized by 6:05 p.m. It went on like that, day after day. Small entries that, at first glance, looked like the musings of someone stubbornly clinging to a forgotten job. But Grace knew better now. These weren't just notes. They were evidence. Walter had been doing the work of a department, alone. She set that notebook aside and reached for the one labeled 2008. As she opened it, a folded note fell out. She unfolded it carefully. It was written in the same handwriting, but the tone was different. It wasn't an incident log. It was personal. I've written hundreds of these. Some days it feels like a whisper into a cave, hoping someone hears it echo back. But I've seen what happens when we stop listening. So I'll keep logging, even if no one reads them. Not for me, for the town. Grace stared at the page. The pen had pressed into the paper with force, like he'd been holding his breath while writing it. The indentations were still visible when she tilted the page to the light. She placed the note back in his notebook and picked up another, this one from 2016. She flipped to the back, where a hand-drawn map was tucked into the final pages. It detailed the emergency overflow procedures for 3 neighborhoods, none of which were included in the town's current civil engineering plans. The mayor stepped beside her, glancing over her shoulder. "This is more than documentation," she said quietly. "It's a ledger of care, of every time you refused to let the town fall." Grace nodded. "And we didn't know." Briggs didn't argue. There was no defense. The oversight had lasted too long. All they could do now was face it. She gestured to the box. "We'll digitize this. Log every entry. Create a formal record." Grace didn't move. Her hand remained on the stack of notebooks, almost protective. "No," she said. "Not just digitize. These need to be read." Briggs turned to her. "Out loud," Grace added. "At council meetings. At school presentations. People need to know who was holding the line when nobody else showed up." The aide, still reviewing the substation systems, looked over. "We'll need to recertify the whole network. File an emergency update with the infrastructure board." Grace set another notebook on the table. "Start with his name." They looked around the small space, its concrete walls, its humming machines, the rusted shelf in the corner. It didn't look like a place that saved lives. It looked like a forgotten room in a forgotten system. But that was the point. Walter Finch hadn't asked for thanks. He hadn't sent letters demanding credit or walked into council chambers to make a speech. He had left a box. A quiet, careful record. Not because he needed to be remembered, but because he needed the system to survive him. Grace reached for the final notebook. The date on its spine read 2023. The pages inside were still crisp. The last entry, penned just 4 days ago, read, "Tested Westgate at 3:14 p.m. Respond slow, likely due to rust buildup. Will return with oil and manual crank. Still operational. Water level stable. Town safe." He had signed it W. Finch. Grace closed the notebook and exhaled. He hadn't stopped, not even at the end. Not because he thought anyone would see, but because someone had to care. The notebook sat closed on the table now, its final page still echoing in Grace's mind like a soft bell. She stared at the brown leather cover, worn smooth at the edges, as though touched hundreds of times by the same hand. For the first time all day, she said nothing. No questions, no responses, just silence. She wasn't in the substation anymore. Her mind had pulled her elsewhere, back through years she hadn't thought to question. There was that storm she remembered when she was 21. The water on Main Street had pooled fast, and the news said the river crested higher than it had in a decade. People in neighboring towns were bailing out basements with buckets, some evacuated entirely. But her street? Dry. Not just lucky, unnaturally safe. She had chalked it up to the incline, maybe the way the street curved just slightly uphill. It hadn't seemed important at the time. Then there was another one, 3 years later, the one that knocked the power out for half the county. The bridge near Maple Street flooded out. Cars were stranded all the way to the highway. But somehow, the culvert near her building had flowed clean, like someone had opened a gate at the right time. Grace's brow furrowed as she tried to remember something else. Someone else. She had seen him. She was sure of it now, in the alley behind her apartment. Not just once, but many times. The man with the cane, always walking the same direction, always with the same pace. Sometimes she'd see him early in the morning, before she left for the diner. Other times, late in the afternoon, just as she was unlocking the side door after her shift. He'd glance her way, offer a nod, and keep going. She had thought he lived somewhere else. Thought maybe he was passing through from the senior apartments near the grocery store. She never imagined his home was the alley apartment, half hidden behind a crooked wooden gate and a wall of ivy. Now it clicked. She had seen him unlock that door, had seen the light from that narrow window glow warm in winter. All this time, he'd been her neighbor. Her throat tightened. She hadn't said more than 10 words to him. Not once. She had hurried past with headphones in, or too tired to smile, or weighed down by things she thought were more important. A bill due, a sore wrist, a double shift. She had never been unkind, but she had never really seen him either. She thought about the moment at the crosswalk, how fragile his hand had felt in hers, how he had thanked her without meeting her eyes, and how, after they reached the curb, he had walked down the alley toward the very building she passed every day. Grace's eyes lifted toward the wall of the substation, but she wasn't really looking at it. She saw something else now, that whole stretch of memory, rewritten in light and detail she hadn't noticed before. Walter had been there in all of it. He had been present during the storms, during the sirens, during the afternoons when everyone else had moved on. His path was silent but deliberate. She felt the weight of it in her chest, the guilt of unawareness, the humbling realization that she had lived next to a man who had saved her town and her apartment, her corner of the world, without ever asking for anything in return. Grace turned slowly toward the mayor. He lived behind my building. Eleanor didn't blink. We know. We found the lease agreement. He signed it under a different name, Walter F. He was there the whole time, Grace said. I just didn't notice. That's what most people say, the mayor replied. Until today. The aide had stepped away, giving them privacy. Grace sat back down, her hands resting in her lap. She was seeing it all differently now. The streets she walked, the storm she remembered, the man in the alley. He hadn't chosen her because she was special. He had chosen her because she stopped, and in doing so, she had changed the end of his story. Or maybe he had written the end long before and was waiting for someone to turn the page. She had turned it, and now there was no going back. Grace didn't respond right away. The offer hung in the air between them, heavier than the silence that followed it. She looked down at her hands, still dusted with faint streaks of grease from the diner, the edges of her fingernails stained from scrubbing out the coffee pot that morning. She flexed her fingers slightly, as if they could tell her what to do, but they offered nothing, just a familiar ache of long shifts and low pay. The mayor leaned forward, her voice softer now. It's not charity. You're the only person who's seen the whole picture, not just the system, but Walter himself. Grace lifted her eyes. But I'm not an engineer. I'm not trained. I barely passed algebra. Eleanor Briggs didn't flinch. You're not being asked to design anything. That part will go to the municipal planning team. But this, she gestured around the room, toward the blinking lights and old logbooks. This is more than infrastructure. It's a legacy. Someone has to organize it, translate it, advocate for it. Someone who understands that this isn't just wires and switches. It's personal. The word struck a chord. Personal. That was the part Grace hadn't been able to shake since reading Walter's final entries. The way he had recorded every storm, every warning, every unnoticed danger with the quiet urgency of someone who didn't need recognition. Just results. Grace sat back, the plastic chair creaking beneath her. She imagined walking into the diner tomorrow morning, tying her apron behind her back, pouring coffee for the same four regulars who never looked her in the eye, her boss barking from the kitchen. Another day of the same. Nothing wrong with it. Just small, contained, expected. But this offer? It felt like standing at the edge of a road she hadn't meant to take, but now couldn't ignore. She looked up again. Why me? The mayor didn't smile, didn't soften, because when it didn't matter to anyone else, you stopped. And that's where things begin. Not with credentials, with character. Grace let the words settle. She didn't like attention. She didn't want to be in charge of anything. She liked routine, quiet moments, invisible days. But she also knew what it felt like to be overlooked. She had lived in that same alley building, walked those same sidewalks. If she didn't take this, who would? The aide returned quietly, holding a file in one hand and a laminated badge in the other. He placed them on the table and stepped back. The badge had her name printed on it, Grace Miller, temporary access. Below it, in smaller text, the words, Project Finch, Emergency Infrastructure Preservation. She picked it up, turning it over in her hand. It didn't feel real. She was a waitress. She wasn't supposed to be in town hall conference rooms or wearing official credentials. But Walter hadn't been supposed to maintain a flood system by himself either. Grace exhaled slowly. What would it involve? Cataloging every part of the Finch system, working with our engineers to trace every modification Walter made, helping us write the historical record. We'll pay for training. You won't do it alone. Grace looked at the badge again. She didn't feel ready, but she also knew that most people never did. She stood, her hand still holding the badge. I'll do it. Eleanor nodded once, not with celebration, but with quiet acknowledgement. Good. We start Monday. As they left the substation, Grace looked back once more. The humming machines, the steady lights, the shelf of Walter's notebooks. It all felt different now. Not like an ending, but the beginning of something she hadn't known she needed. Outside, the sky had cleared. Patches of blue stretched between retreating clouds. The wind had softened. The streets, just an hour ago so narrow and crowded with doubt, now felt open. She stepped into the car, the badge tucked into her coat pocket, and said nothing as the door closed. For the first time in years, Grace Miller had somewhere new to be. The headline ran in bold across the front page of the Stone Point Gazette the following morning. Asterisk Silent Guardian, the man who saved our town. Asterisk beneath it, a black and white photograph of Walter Finch, cropped from an old municipal portrait, stared out with quiet dignity. The image was grainy, the suit slightly oversized, his tie crooked at the collar, but his eyes, steady and unsmiling, gave the story weight. Next to the photo was another image, more recent, taken just weeks ago from a surveillance camera downtown, of Walter shuffling across the street with his cane, his shoulders hunched beneath a tan windbreaker, his grocery bag swinging low. By noon, copies of the paper sat on diner counters, barbershop chairs, front porches, and bus benches across Stone Point. The phones at Town Hall rang steadily. Some callers asked if it was true. Others simply asked where to send flowers. Grace didn't answer the phone that day. She sat in her new office, a converted records room on the second floor of Town Hall, watching to the window as people came and went, holding the Gazette like it was some kind of map they had never known they needed. At the diner, where she had poured coffee for nearly a decade, customers stared at the headline in silence. Her boss, Everett, read the article twice before saying anything. He had never known Walter by name, only as that guy who walks past the alley out back. He leaned against the counter now, his hands deep in his apron pockets, unsure what to say. The same man he'd once told to move along when deliveries were being unloaded had, according to the story, personally prevented catastrophic flood damage for over 20 years, without pay, without recognition. One of the regulars, an older man named Barry who would complain every morning about the diner's toast being too light or too dark, muttered, "Damn shame." We all passed him by. At the grocery store, a cashier named Tasha, barely out of high school, posted a photo of the article on social media with the caption, asterisk, "He used to come in every Tuesday. Never said much. I thought he was just lonely." Asterisk within hours. The post had hundreds of comments. Most were similar, little memories, glances, small acts they suddenly remembered. A man who had held the door. A man who returned a cart without being asked. A man who was always there, unnoticed. The apartment complex behind Grace's building, where Walter had lived for years under an alias, became a quiet place of reflection. Someone left a single white rose at the foot of the alley gate. By evening, there were dozens. A handwritten sign appeared, taped to the wall. Asterisk, "Thank you, Walter." Asterisk, no one signed it. Grace didn't return to the diner. She hadn't quit, not officially, but she didn't need to explain. People knew. Her former co-workers watched the news and felt the shift without being told. Grace Miller, the woman who had always slipped in early, left quietly and never made a fuss, was now the reason the town knew Walter's name. Some residents expressed guilt. A retired councilman admitted in a radio interview that he once lobbied for the dismantling of the Finch barrier system, calling it obsolete. He had no idea Walter was still maintaining it. Others reacted with defensiveness, as if the story reflected badly on all of them. But most simply felt a strange weight of recognition, that a man they'd walked past without thinking had been walking in service of them all along. At a town meeting held that weekend, a microphone was passed through the crowd. Person after person stood to share what little they remembered. He always nodded when he passed me. He never asked for anything. I thought he was just background. The mayor stood last. Her voice didn't rise above the crowd. She didn't ask for silence. She just spoke. Walter Finch gave this town something we didn't ask for, but desperately needed. His legacy is ours now to carry. And seated near the back, not wearing her apron or her usual tired expression, Grace listened. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The town had finally found its voice. And in doing so, they'd finally seen the man who'd saved them. Quietly, persistently, without ever needing to be seen. The room was quiet, but not still. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead pulsed with an indifferent rhythm, and outside the narrow window, the wind swept dry leaves in brief, frantic circles across the pavement. Grace sat alone at her new desk, the laminated project badge resting in a corner like it didn't belong. A yellow legal pad sat in front of her, half filled with uneven notes and scrawled questions, her pen idle across the top. For the 5th time that morning, she stared at the first line she'd written, Restoration Plan, Phase 1. And once again, the words fell hollow. She pushed the pad away and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling tiles. The space didn't feel like hers. It smelled faintly of dust and printer toner, and the wooden floor creaked every time she shifted. She had worked in cramped booths and clattering kitchens for years, surrounded by noise and motion and coffee stains. Here, everything was too neat, too orderly, like it expected more from her than she knew how to give. Grace picked up the badge again. Her name stared back in bold type. Grace Miller, Project Coordinator. It felt absurd. She had been pouring coffee and balancing plates 2 weeks ago. Her biggest decisions had involved how much to overfill a mug or whether to correct a customer's wrong order. Now she was expected to manage a public works legacy. She closed her eyes and rubbed her temples. What if she ruined it? What if she misunderstood a blueprint or lost a critical file or missed something in Walter's notes? The engineers and city staff, some already wary of her presence, treated her politely but distantly. She saw the questions in their eyes. Why her? She had no degree, no titles, no reason to be here except she helped an old man cross the street. That didn't make her qualified. That just made her kind. Kind wasn't enough. Her phone buzzed with a reminder. 1:30 p.m., meeting with Mayor Briggs. She almost didn't go, but at 1:28, she stood, smoothed her thrifted blazer, still bearing the faint scent of lemon cleaner, and walked the length of the corridor to the mayor's office. The door was open. Eleanor was standing by the window, her jacket draped over the back of a chair, a cup of tea cooling on her desk. She turned without surprise when Grace knocked once and stepped inside. "I'm struggling," Grace said, before being asked. Eleanor nodded once, then gestured for her to sit. "Of course you are." "I don't know what I'm doing," Grace continued. "Every meeting I'm just nodding and taking notes I don't understand. I don't speak their language. I feel like I'm pretending." The mayor watched her, then moved to her desk and retrieved something from the drawer. It was Walter's sealed letter, the one they had opened together just days ago. She passed it across the desk, now folded but still neat. "Do you remember what he wrote?" Eleanor asked. Grace nodded. "To the person who helps me when I'm no longer worth helping." Eleanor tapped the letter. He didn't write to the engineer. He didn't write to the council. He didn't write to the next generation. He wrote to someone real. To you. Grace swallowed hard. "But why me?" "Because you didn't need a reason to care. Eleanor said. Walter spent a lifetime being ignored, erased from the very town he protected. And yet, he still believed someone like you would come along, not for recognition, not for status, but because it was the right thing to do. He trusted that. And now we trust you. Grace looked down at the letter again. Her name was there, penciled in faintly at the bottom, added later. Not typed, not official, just human. I'm afraid I'll mess it up, she said quietly. You probably will, the mayor said with a shrug. But so did everyone else before you. The difference is you care. Grace folded the letter again, this time more carefully, smoothing the edges before slipping it into her bag. She still felt uncertain, still felt like the wrong person for the job. But she stood taller as she left the room. She wasn't here to prove herself. She was here to protect something worth remembering. And for now, that was enough. The apartment was still. Dust floated lazily in the warm afternoon light, filtering through a small window above the sink. Grace stood inside the threshold, holding the key that had been given to her by the mayor, Walter's key. The door had creaked open with a sound that didn't feel like welcome or intrusion, just time giving way. The room smelled faintly of old paper, worn wool, and pipe tobacco, though she had never seen him smoke. It was the quiet that hit her hardest, not the kind that comes from emptiness, but the quiet of a space that had waited too long to be noticed. The apartment was modest, barely more than a single room with a small kitchen, a narrow cot, and a wooden desk worn smooth by decades of use. A green banker's lamp still stood on the edge of the desk, its shade tilted slightly. The bulb flickered when she turned it on, but held steady. Against the far wall, a short bookshelf overflowed with engineering texts, field manuals and thin, dog-eared notebooks filled with diagrams in Walter's shaky hand. Grace stepped carefully, as though the floorboards themselves might whisper secrets if she moved too fast. She sat at the desk slowly, her fingers brushing a small stack of envelopes tied together with a length of faded red string. The top letter was addressed to M. Wainwright, Public Works. Another below it, C. Horner, City Council Ret. Others followed, each name carefully written, some with dates as far back as 1997. She untied the bundle and began reading. They weren't angry letters. They weren't demands. Each was a quiet offering. Updates on the flood barrier's condition. Suggestions for maintenance improvements. Gentle warnings. And beneath each careful paragraph, Walter had signed his name without pride or bitterness. Just a name and a hope. She turned to another stack in a small wooden box in the desk drawer. These were unsent too, but different, more personal. One caught her eye immediately, her own name in small, slanted handwriting. Grace. She opened it slowly. The paper was thinner than the others, written on the back of an old receipt. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were clear. Asterisk, I don't know your last name. I don't know where you go when your shift ends, but I've seen you help people when no one else does. I've watched you bring coffee to the man who never tips, refill the water for the woman who talks too long. You didn't know I was watching. That's why I believed you. And today you stopped, asterisk. Asterisk, you didn't hesitate. You didn't look for thanks. You simply saw me and acted, asterisk. You made me believe again. She read it twice, then a third time. Her chest ached in a way she hadn't expected. Not from grief, but from recognition. Walter hadn't written these letters to plead for attention or reclaim lost honor. He had written them to preserve something. A record, a thread through time. Not just of machines and systems, but of people, what they failed to see, what they chose to. She found more letters to others. One to a former protege, long since moved away, urging him not to give up on design work. Another to the mayor, Eleanor, years before she'd even considered running, reminding her to trust the quieter voices. And yet, none of them had been sent. Maybe Walter never believed they'd be read. Maybe he'd hoped someone, someday, would stumble upon them. Or maybe he wrote them simply because the words needed to exist somewhere. Grace returned the letters to their box, then reached for a fresh envelope from the drawer. She didn't know why, not at first, only that the room seemed to ask of her. She sat down, took a pen, and began to write, not as a coordinator or official, but as someone who had seen the man behind the system. A letter of her own. To Walter Finch. I never got to thank you properly. You saw a town worth saving, even when it stopped seeing you. You wrote to people who never responded, and now I'm writing back. The pen moved slower as the sentence grew. The words weren't polished. They didn't need to be. In that apartment, surrounded by the quiet work of a life unnoticed, Grace answered the past with the present, and for the first time, the silence felt full. The morning of the memorial dawned gray and soft, the kind of overcast that muted colors and sounds alike. The lawn in front of Town Hall had been trimmed, the folding chairs arranged in careful rows, and a temporary platform raised just beside the walkway. No bunting, no parade, just quiet gestures, an awning in case of rain, a podium with a small microphone, and a cloth-draped plaque standing on its easel waiting. Grace stood near the back at first, hands clenched around a folded paper she'd read over too many times. She hadn't expected this many people. Dozens of residents gathered in the cool morning air, some still in work boots or aprons from early shifts, others with coats over church clothes. She spotted the high school principal, the librarian, the man from the auto shop who always sat in the corner booth, black coffee, no cream, all of them here. For him, Walter Finch had never asked for any of this. In his lifetime, no one had called him a hero, no brass bands, no awards. But today the town stood still, not because someone told them to, but because they chose to. Mayor Eleanor Briggs stepped to the podium first. She didn't read from a script. She didn't need to. Walter Finch saved this town, she said, her voice level and sure. Not with headlines or speeches, but with quiet hands and unwavering resolve. For decades, he did what most of us never even knew needed doing. And he did it not for recognition, but because it was right. A breeze moved through the chairs. Some people nodded. Others dabbed their eyes. She continued, "The Finch barrier system stands today because of him. Not the concrete or steel, but the man behind the bolts, the inspections, the storm watches. We never thanked him. We never even saw him. But one person did." And then she looked to Grace. Grace froze for a moment. She had spoken to tables full of strangers, remembered breakfast orders from memory, defused cranky customers with a joke or a refill. But this was different. Her throat tightened as she stepped forward, paper trembling in her hand. "I didn't know who he was," she began, her voice smaller than she meant. "I just saw someone who needed help." She paused, took a breath. "I didn't know he'd spent his life protecting this town. I didn't know he'd been watching us, not in judgment, but in hope. He was waiting for someone to stop, not out of pity, not out of duty, just to see him." She glanced at the front row. An older woman was openly crying now, clutching a handkerchief. A child sat beside her, fidgeting with a plastic fire truck. Walter left behind more than a system, Grace continued. He left behind proof that one life, quiet and invisible, can hold up an entire town. And he believed in us, even when we didn't believe in him. I think we owe it to him to start seeing the people we usually pass by. She folded the paper, but didn't look down again. Her voice steadied. Today isn't about guilt. It's about recognition. Walter didn't want applause. He wanted the next person to care. So I will. We all can. She stepped back, not expecting applause, but the quiet was enough. Eleanor returned to the platform and removed the cloth from the plaque. Polished bronze, mounted on oak. It read simply, Walter Finch, 1923 to 2024. The man who protected us, silently ***. Below the text, a small engraving of the flood barrier system curled like a ribbon across the base. At its center, a lone figure stood near a gauge, barely detailed, yet unmistakably Walter. There were no trumpets, no photographers, just a long silence. And then one by one, people stood and moved closer, not to gawk, not to perform grief, but to see. Really see. The plaque caught the light as the clouds began to break, and for a moment, it looked almost golden. A man most had never known, finally honored, not with noise but with truth. Grace lingered after the others left, watching the wind ruffle the corners of a program left behind on a seat. She didn't need to say goodbye. Walter was part of the town now, not buried in the ground, but built into its foundation where he'd always been. The walk back to the diner was slow, not from exhaustion, but from something less visible. Grace kept her hands in the pockets of her coat, the folded program from the ceremony still tucked under one arm. The air had warmed slightly since morning, and patches of sunlight broke through thinning clouds, casting light across the sidewalks in soft, moving shapes. The streets she'd walked 100 times before looked the same, but felt unfamiliar now, like someone had cleaned a dusty window she hadn't realized she was looking through. She passed the barbershop on Main where the owner, always glued to the game on his tiny TV, glanced up and gave her a small wave. She'd never exchanged more than a word or two with him, but today he stepped outside and nodded once, deeply. "Good work, Miss Miller," he said, then returned inside before she could respond. 2 doors down, Mrs. Halpern from a flower shop stood beside a crate of early chrysanthemums. She had a habit of humming old songs while trimming stems, but when she saw Grace, she felt quiet and held out a small bouquet wrapped in newspaper. Yellow and white blooms, tied with string. They were his favorite, she said. Used to buy 1 stem every Friday. Said it made the apartment feel less forgotten. Grace accepted the flowers without speaking. Her throat felt tight again. She hadn't known that about Walter. She hadn't known so many things. As she neared the corner diner, the familiar buzz of conversation, the faint clang of dishes and cutlery, floated out through the half-open door. It sounded the same as always until she stepped inside. The bell above the door gave its usual jingle, but this time the sound landed differently. It wasn't just a transition. It was a pause, a shift. For the first time in months, maybe years, people actually looked up. Her boss, who usually barked over his shoulder or through the kitchen window, came out wiping his hands on a towel. He didn't say much, he never did, but he nodded toward her usual apron hook and said, "Take your time. Coffee's hot." Grace nodded back, too surprised to speak. She turned to the corner booth with a regular customer, Mr. Leary, who always ordered the same toast and jam combo and never left more than 2 crumpled singles as a tip, sat sipping his coffee. He caught her glance and raised his cup slightly, then placed a $20 bill on the table, smooth and flat. "Thank you," he said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it landed like a weight she didn't know she'd been carrying had suddenly been lifted. She hung her coat and tied her apron slowly, her fingers working out a memory. The kitchen door flapped open and shut as orders came through. A toddler giggled near the window. The coffee pot hissed softly behind the counter. But everything felt steadier, like something beneath the surface had clicked into place. A younger waitress passed her with a raised eyebrow. "You okay?" she asked. Grace nodded. "Yeah, just different day." She moved behind the counter, refilled a few mugs, topped off the syrup container. Small tasks, familiar movements. But every step, every glance, was now framed by something larger. Walter had walked past this place every week, unnoticed, had kept the town dry through storms no one remembered because they'd never turned into disasters. He had believed in small, thankless gestures, and Grace had made one without knowing it would ripple this far. She set down a fresh cup of coffee for Mr. Leary. He smiled again, and this time she returned it. The shift rolled forward. Tables filled, emptied, filled again. A kid at the counter spilled orange juice, and Grace mopped it up without frustration. Someone ordered 2 orders of pancakes just before closing, and she didn't mind. At one point, she caught her reflection in the chrome napkin holder. Same apron, same tired eyes, but something steadier behind them. The world hadn't changed in some grand way, but it had tilted. Just enough. Enough to notice the people who walk slower. Enough to understand the weight someone might carry without showing it. Enough to stop when most keep walking. And in a small-town diner that never closed, Grace poured another cup of coffee and kept going, quietly, just as Walter had. The rain started as a whisper against the windows, soft and distant. Grace sat at the console in the operations room, her eyes shifting between the glowing green gauges and the gray clouds building outside. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual, just another late spring storm rolling over the hills. But by mid-afternoon, the tone of the update shifted. The National Weather Service issued a Level 2 alert, then Level 3. A cold front stalled over Stone Point, and the sky thickened into something far more serious. By the time the first wave of thunder rolled across the valley, every person in the restored Finch Barrier substation was at their station. Grace stood at the center, wearing a navy blue windbreaker someone had insisted they all wear now, each stitched with a patch. Finch System Operations. Her name badge still felt strange against her chest, but the weight of it had become familiar. Outside, the wind picked up flattening tree branches and driving rain sideways against the east-facing windows. Power lines swayed above Main Street. Storm drains began to choke on the surge. But inside the substation, the system hummed steadily. Ancient analog components wired with newer safeguards, a careful blend of old design and modern infrastructure. Grace checked the pressure readouts again, her fingers moving across the panel with the same surety she once used to carry 4 plates across a crowded diner floor. Each team member echoed her movements, young techs, retired engineers, even a few volunteers trained over the past month. None of them had known Walter Finch, but they knew his story now, and they showed up because of it. A surge warning flashed amber across the wall monitor. Grace adjusted the manual valve override and pressed the intercom button. Her voice carried through the small building. Section 2, brace for overpass flow. Engage the auxiliary channel. Check backup pumps 3 and 5. Copy that, came the reply from down the hall. She didn't need to shout. No one was panicking. Every person in that room had rehearsed for this. They'd gone over simulations, practiced late into the evening. Grace had insisted they do it all by hand, just like Walter did. Because if the automated system ever failed, someone would have to feel the resistance of the valve wheel, listen to the change in the water's rhythm, trust their senses. By dusk, the storm was in full force. Grace stood over the central panel, watching the water levels crest and fall across the district screens. The river surged high, but didn't breach. The floodgate sensors responded just as Walter had designed them. When a glitch in one of the older circuits caused a red warning light to flash on Channel 4, Grace didn't flinch. She jogged down the corridor with a flashlight, located the jam lever, and released it manually. Dripping rain from her sleeves and brushing grit from her hands, she returned to the operations room to find everyone watching the monitors silent, focused. The mayor had arrived by then, standing quietly behind the group, saying nothing, just observing. Grace nodded once toward her, and Eleanor Briggs nodded back, her expression unreadable but calm. At 3:12 a.m., the rain stopped. Not all at once, but enough. Enough that the threat passed. Enough that the system had done its job. Enough that, for the first time in decades, someone other than Walter Finch had made sure the town stayed dry. The team began to relax, but Grace didn't. Not yet. She walked the perimeter of the station, clipboard in hand, logging the data as she went. She took notes, made sure every gauge was back in range. Then, and only then, did she step outside. The streetlights flickered in the fading mist. Puddles reflected the blinking reds and greens of the control panels inside. Across the low stretch of Main Street, not a single home had flooded. Not one basement needed to be bailed. Not one family was displaced. It wasn't just luck. Grace stood under the overhang and looked up, somewhere behind the clouds. Dawn was pressing forward. The storm was gone, but its weight lingered in the earth, the sky, and the quiet satisfaction of a job done right. She didn't think of herself as a hero. She didn't think Walter would have, either. But she did think he would have stood here, just like this, watching the quiet return, making sure it stayed. And in that silence, Grace allowed herself a breath, a long, slow one, and stepped back inside. There were still logs complete, still systems to review, still stories to carry forward. It had become a quiet ritual, one that no one told her to start and no one asked her to continue. But Grace kept showing up. Every Friday at 11 a.m., she left her office at the substation, crossed 2 blocks past the post office, and stood at the corner of Elmore and 3rd. The sidewalk was uneven there, cracked where tree roots had pushed through from beneath, the faded crosswalk paint clinging stubbornly to the concrete, like it remembered being new. The traffic light overhead always blinked a little slower than the others in town, as if the whole corner ran on its own rhythm. Grace never brought a sign, never told anyone she would be there. She didn't wave or call attention to herself. She just stood. Sometimes she leaned against a rusted pole that held a pedestrian button. Sometimes she sat on the low brick planter, where a stubborn bush of lavender grew no matter the season. She wore her regular clothes, nothing official, just a soft jacket, jeans, and a watch Walter would have liked. Something simple, practical. Most Fridays, the street stayed quiet. A few cars rolled past. A delivery van pulled up to the bakery across the road, and the town bus hissed to a stop at the corner before lurching away again. Occasionally, someone would glance at her, but most people didn't. They were late for something or lost in thought, or just try and make it through their morning. And still she waited. It wasn't about finding another Walter. That wasn't the point. The point was remembering what it felt like to see someone for the first time, and to be seen in return, not as a problem, not as someone in the way, but as a person worth pausing for. On the third Friday, a young man walked by, earbuds and hoodie pulled low. He didn't look up. Grace didn't stop him. She just nodded quietly as he passed. On the sixth Friday, an older woman carrying 2 canvas grocery bags paused on the curb. Unsure about the traffic flow, Grace stepped forward, held her hand up slightly, not commanding, just visible, and walked her across. On the 9th Friday, nothing happened at all. But on the 10th, something changed. A girl, high school age, maybe, jogged the edge of the sidewalk, skidding to stop in front of the blinking red hand. She wore a backpack so full it tilted her sideways. When the light changed, she hesitated, then looked over. Grace was already watching her. The girl laughed a little, embarrassed. First time I've ever seen someone wait here just to wait. Grace smiled. It's not a bad place to stand. They crossed together. After that, it wasn't always Grace alone. Some weeks, people came with coffee. Others stood nearby with folded arms and unsure expressions, like they didn't know why they'd stopped but felt they should. No one talked much. There wasn't ceremony, just presence. The mayor passed by once, didn't say anything, just tipped her head slightly and moved on. Sometimes Grace brought a book. Sometimes she brought nothing at all. One Friday, the rain came down in sheets. She stood under the awning of the post office, her watch ticking away 11 o'clock. No one came that day, but she stayed anyway. It became known eventually as Grace's Corner. Someone painted a small marker into the brick. Asterisk, it started here. Asterisk, the paint was faint, almost hidden, but it was there, just enough to remind. Years from now, someone else might take that spot. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe it would just be another corner again. But for now, it held something more. Every Friday at 11 a.m., Grace stood there. Not because she was looking for a miracle, but because she had once crossed a street, taken the arm of a man who everyone else passed by, and unknowingly stepped into the center of a story that had been waiting for someone like her. And now, she simply stayed, not in the spotlight, not as a leader, just as a presence, just in case someone else needed to be seen.